Hi there, I'm Scott Lowe with ActualTech Media, and thank you for joining us for this week's Weekly Roundup. Today, I'm joined by not just any technical evangelist, but the chief technical evangelist from Druva, Mr. Curtis Preston. Curtis, thank you for joining us today.
Anytime.
And before we get started, I think it's important to make sure that we make an announcement about your new book. You wrote a book around modern data protection for O'Reilly, and we're going to pop a cover picture up for you so you can take a look at that. And that looks like a very protected animal, which is appropriate for the topic. Do you want to give us sort of the 30,000-foot view on what you have in this book and why people should buy it?
Yeah, it's basically the world of commercial data protection, right? So I talk about all the things that you might want to back up and why, right? And various things that you might not think you need to back up. We talk about things like laptops and SaaS providers and whether or not those need to be backed up. Then all of the places that you might, all of the devices that you might back them up to, all of the different ways that you might back them up, and then the different backup software type products that are available to do that. We also talk about archive and disaster recovery. So, all of the various things of the commercial data protection space, covering all the way up to modern stuff like containers and things like that.
In fact, the word modern is right in the book title. So that's good that you've made sure that we're aware this is not data protection for 1994.
Absolutely.
Speaking of data protection, one of the critical things that we see in the news constantly, for which data protection is a critical, hopefully final line of defense, is as ransomware. And we talked a little bit last week about ransomware, but it's such a hot topic and such an important topic that you and I are going to talk about ransomware a bit today. Starting with a little bit of news, and I'm going to refer to my notes to make sure I get everything right. But last week, James Green and I talked a bit about the Kaseya attack that primarily attacked MSPs and the downstream MSP customers via a zero-day exploit that the group Revil found in Kaseya's VSA, their tool that they use to manage desktops for their customers, basically. As of this morning, the news is indicating that Revil appears to have disappeared from the internet. Now, that might at first seem like a good thing for some folks. It's right after the Kaseya attack, right before there's going to be a summit between the U.S. and Russia about for which ransomware is intended to be a point of discussion. But the challenge is that some companies were in the process of negotiating with Revil to try to get their files back, and now they can't. So some of these companies are going to be left in limbo. And the question is are they really gone, or was the pressure just too much, or was did something else happen that they're just gone temporarily? We don't know. Do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, the thing is that Revil's not a person.
Right.
It's a fake. It's a DBA, right? They're doing business as Revil.
Yeah.
And so it could go away because it doesn't really exist in the first place. It's not like it's a person that you can go hunt down. It's just it's a non-legal business entity. So maybe it's gone, maybe it's not, but apparently you can't contact them anymore, and that does really. They must have gotten a chunk of money from somebody, and then they're like, yeah, score, and then we're out of here. So maybe they're gone in the sense that these people can't negotiate with them, which that really stinks for them.
DarkSide went away right after the Colonial Pipeline attack too, and who knows if they're really gone for good. Right. I've read a few articles on. Do these groups have scruples? They obviously money is a motivator, and big corporations. I mean, if you ever watched Mr. Robot and stuff like that, the big corporations are evil places, and everybody else is the little guy.
Right.
And the collateral damage was unanticipated, so they are reassessing. I don't know if I believe that or not, but that's some speculation that we see out there.
Well, there is. I know certain groups, they have. It's sort of like. It's just like, it's like there's honor among thieves, sort of.
Right.
So one of the things that I have read from other places, there was a hospital attack a while back where they attacked a university, and the university's hospital was inadvertently impacted. And the ransomware company actually gave them the keys for free to unlock the hospital because it wasn't their intended target. I think they have some scruples, but I'm not giving them, I'm not giving them much credit for that.
Oh no, I agree with you completely. It's the honor among thieves is probably a good way to put it, but that only takes you so far. One of the things I think is important to talk about is the evolution that we're seeing in ransomware. Obviously, if we look at traditional ransomware, and I hate to use the word legacy because that has, legacy ransomware. The thought was, I've got your files, give me money, and you get your files back. And it was a simple transactional. You either do this, or if you don't have backups, you're going to be in a world of hurt. Today, that's changing. You want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing with regard to the new ways that ransomware bad guys are extorting people?
Yeah, and it didn't appear to be the case in the Kaseya attack, by the way.
Right.
It was sort of a traditional, like you said, legacy ransomware attack. It requires this new thing is that some call it extortionware. So the idea is that they're going to exfiltrate your data, and they're going to store some of your data that might either embarrass your company or do it business harm. So an example of embarrassment goes all the way back to the Sony attack many years ago, where they exposed a bunch of emails where it showed how Sony really spoke about the people that were under contract with Sony Pictures, and it was very embarrassing to the company. And or they might, hey, we have your recipe for the what is it? Is it 11 herbs and spices? KFC.
Oh, KFC.
Your KFC, and we have your 11 herbs and spices, and we're going to show the world what your recipe is if you don't give us money. That would be a very simplistic example of that.
Yeah, and the challenge there is, it shifts it from a simple transactional thing, like I said before, to where you could potentially recover from backups to it doesn't matter if you have backups or not, because if they have your data and they're willing to do something damaging, you either pay them or what's your recourse?
Yeah, you don't really have a recourse, right?
Right.
Especially if what it is, if it's literally it is 11 herbs and spices, right?
I think it is.
It's been a while. So if it's that level of secret data, right? If basically this is your, it's the recipe for your coronavirus vaccine, right? And you're going to give it to the world. If it's that much of your company's, intellectual property, you basically, theoretically, if you don't pay it, your company then has a major hit in revenue. So you do that. But the other is this embarrassing stuff. So, like what happened with Sony, we have these emails or these documents that show this embarrassing thing, that your company has engaged in either unethical or illegal business practices. That's more like blackmail. That's a different decision. And I would reference the Sony hack. Like at this point, they took a big hit, but Sony basically they weathered that particular exposure.
Right.
So it's a very different decision.
Oh yeah. And it's a much harder one to decide to do, because you still don't know if you give them the money, are they going to just release everything anyway? Although that would probably preclude them from getting ransom from the next victim. So you would hope that, they would do the quote unquote right thing. But you just never know.
There is a concept, again, I hate using these terms, but there is the concept of like customer service within the ransomware business community. And there is a generally accepted practice among those bad guys that if you get the money, you're supposed to give up the keys or not release the data, because if they do start doing that, then nobody will ever pay the ransoms again. But you literally, it's just, again, this all goes back to physical attacks, right? So you pay the ransom, there's no guarantee that they don't kill the person that they've captured, right? Back in the old days, right? There's no guarantees when dealing with these people.
I want to come back to new kind of ransomware that we're seeing in a minute, especially with what is being proposed as far as how you protect against that. But to go back to what you just talked about, the ransomware business community, which I mentioned last week, just blows my mind that ransomware as a service is actually an industry,
Yeah,
but it is.
it's a fast growing industry.
Yeah, they have contractors around the world that are working with them and customers that are willing to pay them to do what they do.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a twisted market when you really think about it, but it's like anything else. There's supply and demand.
Yeah.
And there
I
you
mean,
go.
it's no different than contract killers, right? There's been murder as a service for eons, right? This is just the latest way to do it, and because of things like Bitcoin, the fact that you can exchange money in an anonymous, seemingly undetectable way, it has enabled all of this, which is a whole other discussion that that we could have. But yeah, so ransomware as a service is very much a thing at this point.
For anybody watching, please, if you have comments or questions, please make sure you ask them on the in the appropriate place in your browser, whether LinkedIn or YouTube. We would like to hear from you as well. I want to go back to how you protect yourself against this emerging form of ransomware. It's, if we look at the world of information around security and IT, we used to take a very perimeter-based approach. So we would basically surround our enterprise with a moat and then hope nobody got in, because once you're in, you've got the keys to the kingdom, right? And that's kind of what is being proposed as where we are now with ransomware. We have a big squishy middle that once you have one vulnerability exploited, it's easy to exploit the rest of the organization. You shared with me a Forbes article around entity level encryption. Can you kind of give us a 30,000-foot view on what that is and why it's probably the next bastion of defense in the ransomware fight?
Yeah, I think it's basically taking that soft, chewy interior and protecting it. The idea is, well, the only way, to my knowledge, there are a number of things you can do to thwart such attacks. But if you do get attacked, the only way to not be vulnerable to extortionware is to encrypt the data so that they can't see it. And so this idea of entity level encryption is what's discussed in that article, which actually we're actually recording a podcast with the authors of that article this afternoon. So be interesting to see what they say.
And it's your backup podcast. Where can people see that?
Yeah, so it's the Backup Central's Restore It All podcast. We'll be discussing with the authors of that.
Awesome. And so basically what that does is harden the middle, right? So theoretically, you reduce the points of infiltration into your data. And even if they get the whole database, essentially the key management and the database are separate. So you get the database that's useless anyway. You'd have to have the key management as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, so you need both things. So I do think it's important, we sort of skipped over the old world, which is the world where I live, which is data protection, right? That world is still very necessary, right?
Oh yeah.
To be able to restore your data, not just your data, you need a very good DR process, right? So that you can be able to restore your data center, your computing environment very quickly, so that you don't have to, pay the ransom for that reason. But then also, this is the idea of encrypting the data in the first place inside the places where you store your data, so that if they get your backups or they get direct access to the file system, what they see is just garbled, encrypted nonsense, so they can't use it to extort your company. So that's the concept behind entity level encryption.
Yeah, and I think to your point, that's critical is if you don't have good backups, the legacy ransomware is not going anywhere. In fact, it's still the most common kind of ransomware out there in the vast majority of cases. It's just there's outliers where we're talking about this data exfiltration issue. And if you don't have a robust data protection methodology, you're finished, essentially.
I will add to that. So I just wrote an article for Network World that came out this month that talked about the fact that people like me have perhaps inadvertently focused too much on backup and not on the stuff that you have to do before a restore, if you get a ransomware attack, there are a whole bunch of activities and things that you need to do. Things like, basically, you have to make sure that you have stopped the infection before, restoring your systems. You need to figure out what has been infected. You need to, there are a number of steps that you could do to stop further infection, things like shutting down network traffic, especially shutting down external network traffic so that they don't talk to command and control servers, things like shutting off RDP so that they can't use that to infect further servers. And the best thing is to just literally shut off everything in the area where you've been infected so that you can then one at a time figure out what has been infected, what hasn't been infected before you start the restore. So I just realized that even I'd been focusing too much on backup and restore, and there's all this other stuff that you need to do before you do a restore. That's really important.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of ransomware, addressing ransomware is obviously a multi-layered need.
Yeah.
Like, one, you have prevention. Second, you have mitigation, which is what you were just talking about, where if something does happen, you take initial mitigation steps to make sure that it's not spreading throughout the enterprise inadvertently. And then third, you have recovery in the event that once you make sure that that you don't have it anywhere else, you can recover. And that goes back to, really getting the basics right. And so many organizations still do things that are easy, right? It's easier. We can just give, this tool domain admin rights, and then it has everything it needs. And for decades now, people have been saying, don't do that. But some tools, that's the only way they work. And those tools, you need to figure out either.
Yeah, you need to stop using those tools.
Yeah. Or if that's the way that you're approaching the problem, you need to take more time for deployment to make sure that you're giving it adhering to some kind of at least privileged access model, which again, a lot of organizations still don't do. One of the things that I still think is missing in organizations is user training. We see a lot more of that, but we still see lots of organizations that don't do it. In fact, Acronis did a study that said that 94% of phishing attacks are the result of phishing, which is essentially, social engineering in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
Which leaves 6% to other things. And that's how, things like the Kaseya attack worked. It was a 0-day vulnerability. One of the other things I don't see organizations always doing is routine account reviews. And and you have to include human resources in these. And at first I'd see people like, why would I include HR? One of the things I've seen in some of the consulting work I've done is that internal transfers are a significant source of elevated privileges. They have rights to their old department and to the new department because nobody thought to get rid of the old rights because they don't need them anymore. So they have access to more things than they should. Now that's prevention. And we have things like, using a password vault for privileged accounts, and not just doing, once a quarter or once a year vulnerability scans, but doing something that's ongoing, looking for errant patterns in network traffic to see if something's going on that shouldn't be. But when it comes to backup, like if we've failed that first level of prevention, and once we've mitigated the issue, what are some best practices that people should be thinking about when it comes to what they're doing for backup and recovery to make sure that they can actually recover?
Well, I think one of the saddest things that I see when I read ransomware stories is the following phrase: and the backups were also infected.
Exactly.
Right? It just kills me, right? So one of the things is to make sure that your backups are not stored in a place or in, I hate coming across as like anti-Windows because I don't feel that I am. But given that Windows is the #1 attack vector for ransomware, I don't believe in storing your backups on either a Windows backup server or a server like, to use an example, like a data domain server that is accessible via like NFS or SMB from a Windows mounted server, because because your Windows-based backup server can then be infected, and it can then infect your ransomware. I'm sorry, it can then infect your backups. So that's really one really important thing, and which means either using a Linux-based backup system or an offsite, a cloud-based service like ours, where there is no way to get to the backups. I think that's really number one. And then the other is to make sure that you have a way to restore your entire environment from the computing environment, right? So because I think a lot of people, they don't think about, unfortunately, historically, DR plans have not been at the forefront, right? So people, they don't spend enough money. It's getting to a place where everybody really needs that plan. And you don't need just a DR plan. You need a ransomware focused DR plan, right? How are we going to respond to a ransomware attack, and how quickly? Because if you could get your computing environment up quickly enough, you can just thumb your nose at a traditional ransomware attack.
Right. How often do you see organizations that, what do you have any stats right now on how many organizations are falling victim because their backups got encrypted too?
I'm seeing, I don't have a stat, but
yeah,
but I read, obviously, every ransomware article that comes across my desk. I read it, and I've read it in a significant portion of them, right? And I don't want this to be an anti-competitor thing. All of our competitors, even the ones that are Windows-based, have Linux-based ways to store your backups, right? It does require extra effort, but you can do that, right? And also, if you're using, again, since I threw out the data domain name, if you're using something like data domain and you're using a vendor that communicates with data domain, use one of the proprietary ways to connect those two devices, not NFS and SMB, that makes the backups directly read-writable from a Windows server, right? So this isn't an anti, companies other than Druva message. It's a just don't store your backups, that way.
Yeah, I mean, and some of these things at this point should be considered pretty basic, but there's a lot of inexperienced people out there that have, and sometimes until you go through it, you don't understand exactly why you do things the way you're supposed to.
Yeah, you talked about the easy things, right? If you're a Windows-centric shop, the easy thing is to have a Windows-only backup system, right? It's Windows, you know what it is, and all I'm saying is, I just don't think that's a good idea, right? Obviously, I think the most secure thing is to have it stored offsite in a service that you literally have no access to. We don't have servers that our customers could have hacked, right? Their data is stored in multiple layers of security away. But I just really want you, if you have a Windows only backup system where your data is stored on a disk that is directly accessible as files on that Windows server, that's what I'm saying. You've got to stop that. Talk to your backup vendor. All of the vendors have a way to do something other than that. It will increase your complexity if you stay with an on-prem system. It will increase your complexity because you have to look at something like Linux. And if you don't know anything about Linux, that's a different security problem. But anyway, so.
Curtis, this was a great conversation. I hope people learned something from this discussion around what's happening in the world of ransomware, some of the emerging ransomware trends, the unfortunate industry that's arisen over the last few years, and some basic steps that they can take to protect themselves against the scourge of the internet these days. Thank you for joining us this week.
Anytime.
And before we go, we want to make sure that everyone's aware of two of ActualTech Media's events that we have coming up in the coming week. First of all, we have the Wrangling the Cloud, Avoiding Missteps and Improving Application Environments megacast on July 21st. This is all things cloud, how you make sure you do things correctly to make sure your applications continue to perform flawlessly. And the one that's really related to today's discussion is assessing and performing data protection, disaster recovery as a service, and overall disaster recovery capabilities event on July 22nd. Both of these events are sold out from a vendor perspective. So there's going to be a lot of great data, a lot of great information you're going to learn from both of these events. So please make sure you join us for both of those. You can visit events.actualtechmedia.com to register for either one of those. And as always, thank you to the audience for joining us this week, whether you're watching this live or on demand. We appreciate you, and we'll see you next week.